Hello everyone, and welcome back to another great episode of Hive Live. I'm Katie Dodson, and today we'll be diving into all your burning questions about CMMC certification assessments, what to expect, tips and tricks from certified assessors, and everything you need to know to set you up for success with your C3PAO. If you're not already following us, what are you waiting for? We're dropping cybersecurity insights daily over at Hive Systems on all the major platforms, so go hit that follow button. Joining me today are my co-hosts and fellow Hive Systems team members, Andrew Bradley and Denis Dodson. Andrew, Denis, and I are all CMMC certified assessors, collectively participating in more than 21 certification assessments across both Hive Systems and our other C3PAO partners in the ecosystem, here to share our insights from the assessor side of the table. So let's jump in. If you're here, you probably already know that you need to worry about CMMC. You may have to do CMMC level 2 certification in the future. And now with the 48 CFR rule coming out and being effective as of November 10th of this year, that deadline is quick approaching. There are not very many C3PAOs in the ecosystem. There are a lot of defense contractors that need to be compliant. And we are expecting level 2 to be in effect no later than November 10th of next year. So that deadline is approaching quickly, and there are many questions. There's a lot of misinformation out in the space. So we're here to try to answer some of those burning questions that we're seeing from a lot of the OSCs in the space and give you that insight into the assessment process from our own experience as well. So diving into some of those FAQs, Andrew, how long does a typical level 2 assessment take from start to finish?
Yeah, and the answer to that basically just depends on the C3PAO. For us, from scoping call through certification is about 3 months in total, although we're working on that schedule still. As we go through these things, we adjust our schedule based on feedback and based on lessons learned, but generally speaking, it's about 3 months. Most of that is downtime, so the bulk of the lift is really in that interview week that we have, where we do all the walkthroughs of the controls and the domains, and then the 10-day correction period after that, where if there's anything that wasn't met or was trending not met during that interview period, some corrections can be made, and we'll validate those during that 10-day period. And that's basically the brunt of it, right? So the most rigorous portion of this assessment process is going to be that interview week, and that can usually be kind of headed off a little bit by the quality of evidence that we receive in the week leading up to it. But then everything kind of leading up to that is assessment planning, pre-assessment phase type stuff, where we're doing the scoping call. We're doing just some more information gathering, readiness checks, and then we go into that assessment week and that interview week where the brunt of the actual activity and assessment takes place. So about three months from soup to nuts there.
And then Denis, what kind of evidence are assessors actually expecting to see? Can you get away with just screenshots, or do you need technical demonstrations as well?
So I think it depends. Having screenshots is helpful. Can definitely reduce the time spent in the interview week, both for assessors as well as assessees. Ultimately, it does come down to us needing to validate that some screenshots will be necessary for technical details. But basically, there are some controls that will always need technical demonstrations. But not just that. I think in some capacity, having technical demonstrations can also speed things up compared to screenshots, which sounds backwards because you might think like, oh, screenshots are the fastest. But I think for some things like multi-factor authentication, sometimes it's just easier to show like someone failing to log into the system rather than having like 3 different screenshots showing that. So it can really depend.
So kind of along that same vein, obviously screenshots help because they give some of that context. Getting the technical demonstrations gives us that confidence to validate the controls, make sure that what you provided as a screenshot is actually in place. But what about documentation? If someone has the technical implementation in place, how important is it to also have documentation reinforcing that?
Very. There's actually a number of assessment objectives that absolutely require documentation. Typically, the ones where you see something must be identified or documented or defined, but you also can't really start an assessment without a fully documented SSP. And I could speak from personal experience. A well-documented SSP goes an extremely long way. So in that way, documentation is actually critical to the CMMC process. There's some flexibility for documentation corrections during the assessment if your technical implementation is correct but not properly reflected in the documentation. But you can't create new policies, new procedures, documents during the assessment itself. The documentation has to already exist, has to be final and approved before your assessment, and needs to follow internal change management processes and approval processes before your assessment can complete any before your assessment is complete for any corrections.
So you can't accept any draft documentation, even if it's something they have updated as a result of the assessment, correct?
Correct.
All right. So Andrew, as a lead CCA, what happens if a company is not fully compliant at the end of their assessment?
Yeah, so this question comes up quite a bit, and what Dennis just talked about with the 10-day correction period and the updating of documents that already exist, that's one thing that can be tackled during the assessment or immediately following that interview week. But if it's something that you guys don't, like the OSC isn't going to be able to meet, we generally look to see if that's something that can be placed on a POA&M. If it's a 1-point control, or if it's the encryption control knocked down to a 3-pointer, those are some things that you can carry on a POA&M. And if your score is going to be 88 or higher, even with those deficiencies, you can still get a conditional CMMC level 2 certification, even if you carry some POA&Ms. And that means basically that you'll have 180 days to correct those deficiencies, correct those POA&Ms, and have them revalidated and retested by the C3PAO. And then once they're revalidated and tested, and assuming that they meet the actual control objectives, then you will get into that final status. So once those POA&Ms are cleared out and validated and you pass those specific objectives that were associated with them, you'll move from conditional status to final status. If you do not fix those POA&Ms and you do not pass the validation and retesting, then you will have to start over. You'll have to get a whole new assessment because you won't be able to move from conditional status to final status, and that conditional status will expire at the end of that 180-day period. So you will have to get an entirely new assessment completed, certification assessment completed, if you do not correct those POA&Ms and get them retested and validated within that 180-day period.
All right, thanks, Andrew.
Sure.
And then I'll round out our FAQs with one of our most commonly asked questions: how much does an assessment cost? As president, I'm the one who gets a lot of those inquiries and puts together a lot of our pricing. So unfortunately, again, it depends. A lot of the answers when it comes to CMMC is it depends. We base our pricing on the level of complexity of your environment and the corresponding level of effort for our assessment team. The Cyber AV and the CAP have defined that every assessment team needs at least a lead CCA, a CCA, and a CCA who is a QA. So we're factoring all of that in when we are determining pricing. If you have an environment that is entirely contained within GCC High and a VDI, you have no removable media or printing, your assessment is going to cost less than an environment that's entirely on premises, has no inherited controls, has multiple sites in scope. This is why C3PAOs can't just reply to an email saying, "Can I get a quote?" We actually have to know more about your environment and your setup. You are always going to expect that there's going to be a discovery call or a form you have to fill out in order to get details to your C3PAO for them to give you a more consistent and accurate price. So there's not really an easy, it's always going to be this much type of answer. You should always expect that you're going to have to answer some questions in order for your C3PAO to get you an accurate quote. And again, it's going to come down to the level of complexity of your environment, the level of effort required. If you have multiple sites in scope, that's going to cost more as opposed to having a completely virtual environment. And so the pricing does depend ultimately on your environment and the level of complexity. I do often get questions about, I only have 2 or 3 people in my enclave. Shouldn't it be less expensive? Unfortunately, the nature of an assessment is actually to test the processes in place and the technical configurations. We are not looking at every single individual in your environment and every single training certificate that they've completed and things like that. So having fewer people in your environment really does not have much of an impact on the price of an assessment. So covering the FAQs, we're going to switch gears a little bit and dive into lessons learned from assessments and some tips and tricks. So I'm going to open these questions up to both of you guys. Let's start with, what are some of the most common gaps and shortcomings that you are seeing in the assessment process?
Yeah, I can hop in real quick, Dennis. So the biggest issue that we run into quite frequently is either a misscoped environment or the boundary isn't properly identified. So we'll consistently run to situations where there are either, CUI assets or there are SPAs that weren't accounted for that need to be accounted for, and we've already either kicked off the assessment or we're in the last stages of the planning phase, and so it kind of throws a monkey wrench into all the planning that we've done already up front. So we've got to go back and reassess some of that information just to make sure that we can continue moving forward, especially when it's an external service provider, whether it's an SPA or it's a CUI asset, ESP, especially if it's a cloud service provider, making sure that those are fully accounted for in the scope of the assessment and in the boundary and in the documentation, right? So it should be captured in the architecture diagrams, the data flow diagrams, as well as the SSP, making sure that you've accounted for that properly, accounted for the customer responsibility matrices properly, and incorporated your responsibilities into your control environment that you have to do there. That is the biggest issue that we see. There's a couple of other things, scoping wise that we run into, but that's really it. It's generally about these ESPs and SPAs that are the big problem when we're getting into assessment time. Dennis, anything you can think of off the top of your head?
Yeah, we sort of talked about it already, but how sort of quickly things can go wrong during the documentation sort of phase. I think it's often forgotten that the SSP should be a useful document. It should be of use to you and your team, but also during the assessment process. So when we see things like when we see things in SSP that aren't written out as useful as possible, so something like see this policy is all you write for a specific objective, that doesn't help the assessment process, but certainly doesn't help your team as well. So if they have to if they have already dug through your SSP to find specific guidance and then have to go dig through another policy without actually being pointed to the right place in that document, doesn't really help anyone. So that's definitely, it makes assessments hard, but it makes day-to-day as well difficult for your team. So
yeah, absolutely. That's something that we we stress if we're doing readiness for a client, is making sure that the SSP captures enough detail to get you from at least A to Z with regards to how that specific assessment objective is implemented or met. This way here, nobody has to go hunting through additional documentation, or you don't have to sit in an hours long walkthrough session during the interview week for that, if it can be something that's conveyed in the SSP directly. Some technical controls, trip some people up sometimes, the FIPS validated cryptography for encryption and transit encryption and rest and remote access sessions. But generally speaking, the technical controls aren't where usually people fall down. It's generally the scoping stuff, the documentation stuff, and honestly, just having the right people in the room for the interview process. A lot of times we get our boots on the ground there, ready to go, trying to make this as efficient as possible, make it as easy for the OSC as possible, and we just don't have the right people in the room to cover all the topics we need to. So that's definitely something that trips people up a lot as well.
And that's a big part of why we do our assessments the way that we do. We have the scope and call and the readiness check well in advance of the assessment, because we are commonly finding scoping and boundary issues and issues with documentation in the SSP. And we're checking those early. That's why our whole timeline takes at least 3 months, like Andrew mentioned before, is ultimately to make sure we're catching those things early enough that you have the opportunity to fix them before you get into your certification assessment, without having to just reschedule assessments all the time. So we are factoring this into our process and trying to give our OSCs the opportunity and the time that they need to make corrections as a result of the scoping and readiness checks. But Andrew and Dennis, you already kind of touched on some of this already, but what are some of the more commonly misunderstood controls, or the controls that people are more often failing in the assessment because they don't understand them?
I'll hop in. So the one that we always see is the event log review. I think it's 3.3.3 off the top of my head, but basically in the AU control family. And basically people see this and they assume that it means the same as the other control that's related to reviewing auditable events, reviewing the things that occur in the system, or monitoring the system itself. This is actually talking about the review of the list of things that you are caring about, that you are logging in the system. So we always see this one misinterpreted as the event log that they're already doing, event logging and monitoring that they're already doing, when in fact it's just talking about the list that you've defined for all your components to log to, your SEM or your correlation system. Reviewing that list, just that list of things you want to capture, and making sure it's still applicable, and making sure that it's relevant to the environment, based on threat intel, based on risk assessments that you guys perform on an annual basis. So that's one of the biggest controls that we see kind of misinterpreted all the time, is that event log review. could be probably worded better by NIST, I think, a little bit. And there is some wording change for Rev 3. So hopefully that helps clarify this one a little bit. But yeah, that's one we always see people kind of misconstrue.
Yeah. I would say one that I don't think I've seen an assessment that hasn't had this in some capacity. But it's in CM. I think it's 3.4.7, but I think it's got multiple different objectives to it, but the key takeaway is basically needing to define and actually putting into words what it means to have essential and not essential ports, protocols, and services. It seems very silly, like just having a simple definition in there. But what we look for as assessors is it defined? Is it actually put into words? Like what do you define as your essential ports? What are your non-essential ports? Simply saying a quick sentence in there can go a long way in actually meeting this control in the right way. So a lot of times we see like, oh, it's not fully defined or it isn't fully, there isn't a list of ports that are actually open. And a lot of times we just say like, oh, the non-essential ports are the essential ports are like the non-essential ports are the ones that aren't essential, which sounds lacking and kind of is, but simply defining it in your SSP can go a long way in meeting the control.
Yeah, that actually reminded me of another one because we often see, the definition ones trip people up because they don't realize that they actually have to define those things explicitly. But the definition of privileged functions versus non-privileged functions, definition of security functions versus non-security functions, making sure that you're explicit in what you are considering a privileged function versus a non-privileged function, right? So if you're trying to separate user functionality, you're trying to separate user access to privileged functions from a non-privileged account, for example, or vice versa, making sure you define those so that, when an assessor comes in and they're looking at the standard user account, making sure it cannot execute privileged functions. You've defined what privileged functions are so that they have something to basically measure that against. Same thing goes the other way. If you have privileged accounts, defining what the basic user function is, the non-privileged function is, so that they can verify that the privileged accounts don't have the ability to do those non-privileged functions or those non-security functions. So just making sure that like the things that require you to define something are explicitly defined. And also it kind of helps you craft your narrative a little bit and craft your scope of what these things mean. So if you're defining them, taking the time to define them explicitly, it's going to help you out in the long run because it doesn't leave as much ambiguity that the C3PO is then going to have to dig into a little bit deeper. So you're closing off the rabbit holes that they could possibly go down.
Yep. And I think that reminded me as well. One thing, and this comes back to the documentation versus technical demonstration one, a lot of the times, I wouldn't necessarily call this a pitfall because we talk it out through the interview process, but a lot of the times I've seen assessments either provide way too much or way too little for baselines. So it's hard to hit that balance between like what exactly do I provide, what configurations do I show, and like what do I basically show versus telling. And it just comes down to like meeting that balance of like talking to your assessment team and say what their expectations are and what is relevant and what is not relevant, because having a giant folder filled with configurations that may or may not be useful, a lot of it can just come down to like a 5-minute conversation rather than having a large export of various different things that might not come up anyways.
So before I move on to our next question here, I got to thinking, when it comes to scoping, I think it's important for us to talk about the CMMC definition of process, store, and transmit CUI, specifically the fact that they include accessing as part of processing. What are some of the implications for scoping with including accessing CUI as process, store, and transmit?
Yeah, and this one we've talked about a lot internally, Katie, right? Like this is something where it creates a lot of scope creep and it creates issues with the way people end up even implementing their boundary and their solution. We've got some folks who've look for more modern solutions like a VDI solution. They look for an enclave, and they're really trying to keep things out of scope. And the problem with access is once you grant that access to a component or to a system or even a person, they technically become a CUI asset. And the only way you can kind of get around that is by sequestering the actual access off into a system you're comfortable with bringing into scope. So that's where the VDIs come into play. So like if you want to keep your endpoints out of scope, you have to fully keep them out of scope. You can't even allow in-browser CUI access because by the CFR rule, the 32 CFR rule there, even browser access itself is considered access, and that brings that endpoint into scope then. However, there is that specific carve out for a VDI. So if you're accessing, a VDI from your endpoint, you're going into the VDI, and then you're accessing the CUI in a browser or in another solution, then it keeps that endpoint out of scope. That VDI comes into scope, but it keeps your endpoints out of scope. So really just kind of taking account and inventory of where all of that SPT, right? Store, process, transmit is occurring, and also all those access points, because you're going to have to consider those, especially if you're developing your system right now. You're trying to work on developing a scope and a boundary that works for your organization, and you're trying to keep a lot of things out of scope because you don't want the headaches. Maybe you're a subsidiary, maybe there's a parent organization that's got some complexity, and you're trying to make sure that you're keeping things nice and bundled. Accounting for access is going to be very important. And that is something that is different than a lot of other frameworks, stuff like FedRAMP, right? Where federal information flows, that could be considered part of the FedRAMP boundary, but it does not consider just access to be something that has to come into scope. So that's where CMMC is a little bit different. So you do have to consider that access portion as well.
Thanks, Andrew.
Sure.
Denis, you touched on some of this already, but what do the successful, well-prepared organizations typically have in common when you're getting into these assessments?
Sort of the opposite of what the pitfalls we just talked about. So if the ones that I've seen that have gone the smoothest have had very clear SSP, very clear documentation. And that goes as far as to say, specifically for assessors' needs, in your SSP, pointing specifically to what objective is being hit by what you're putting in there. So if you're putting in specific language, so it doesn't always help to put in as much information as possible. Being succinct, being clear in what you're saying, like this meets this objective, this meets objective A, can be very much more useful than putting in a paragraph of information. Similarly, having very clear organization like folder structure, very useful. I've had assessments where they just dump in all the information, all the files that you might need in a single zip file, and it just basically spits out as I don't want to call it a mess, but it can be hard to go into. And I've also had assessments where it's like folder by folder for each objective on each where they give like very specific, like if you want this configuration, look at this file, and like the assessment takes half as long just because you're not spending so much time digging through various files to see like what you might need and what you might not need, and wasting time looking at documents or screenshots of things you might not need. So it's basically the short answer there is like everything I listed for pitfall, do the opposite of, and you're good.
Yeah. Another thing that they generally have in common is they've brought on either a CCP or a CCA to their staff to help them get prepared, or they've gone through readiness with a CCP or CCA organization, or with CCPs or CCAs to make sure that they understand the assessment objectives, that they've implemented those appropriately, and that they've got all their documentation buttoned up very nicely. That's probably the biggest, the best money you could spend probably is on readiness for this.
Absolutely. So I'll ask a couple questions here, just from the assessor's perspective. What is the actual process of conducting the assessment like? Denis, can you elaborate a little bit on what that's like from the assessor's perspective and what people should expect from their actual day-to-day assessment experience, at least with us?
Absolutely. So specifically from us, what you can expect is probably a very similar sort of feel from assessment to assessment. So we're really looking at Monday through Friday, a single week most of the time, depending on if you opted in for the different sort of assessment package, things like that. It might be further than a week, but what you're really looking at is Monday is more than likely going to be our heads down day. What this means is we might meet with you at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, whatever your time is, and say like, hey, this is what we're going to be doing for the week. And then that might be the last you hear us for Monday, because we are heads down, looking at documentation, looking at what's been provided, looking at your SSP, basically going through as much as we can to just see like what has been given, what has not been given, what has been written, what has not been written. And that's Monday. And then we'll come into Tuesday, basically starting off the assessment process. So usually we start with AC because it's a beast. But from Tuesday onwards, we'll be going through each of the families and objectives, basically to see and talk through anything that we might need further, because we've seen everything on Monday, and so from Tuesday through Friday, it doesn't usually take that, or for most of the assessments we have, if they're going well, we don't go anywhere close to Friday. But basically, we start with Tuesday through whenever we need to, just talking through like what we're seeing, what we expect, what we're not seeing, and at the end of each day, we'll have a hot watch, basically saying like, this is what we talked about for this day. This is the stuff we saw, but like this is all stuff we still need, and things like that. So most of the assessments we have that similar pattern of start looking at documentation and then just go and just talk through interviews. So.
All right. I mean, it sounds like it's a little bit painful sitting through and going through every single assessment objective, but how do we try to lighten it up a little bit so it's not quite so painful? What are we doing?
So I would say that a big value we have is sort of bringing in a not. Each of us on this call has sat through different types of audits at different companies and things like that. And it can be very, very dry experience. And I know I can speak for myself as well as for Katie. We've also been on the DIB side of things. We both worked at the DC3. So we kind of know what the companies are coming to the table with. So I think what we bring to the table is a little bit less dry. We're not just going through objective by objective. We're really trying to get to the meat of what it's asking. It can be easy to just say like, the AC, we're starting at the very top, reading through each of the objectives, like this is like verbatim, and your interviews can go through all the way through Friday if you let it, or you can actually get to what the CMMC controls are expecting and what the true meaning of the objectives is, and actually have a conversation, which is nice because it's assessments always sound like they can be a nightmare or a headache, but it's also not terribly fun from the assessors side as well. So any way we can just make it less of it's not an audit, but less of an assessment and less of like that audit sort of feel, and more just having a conversation about like what's currently in place, what security benefits, things like that are either working or not working, can go a long way in making it feel less dry, I think.
And then Andrew, you've participated on a number of other assessments with other C3PAOs as well. Is there anything that you think we do differently that kind of sets us apart from some of those C3PAOs as well?
Yeah, so we definitely spend a lot more time reviewing the evidence up front. So we do request the evidence early on. Some folks don't request it as early, and they either wait till the week of the interviews and they do a lot of screen sharing or a lot of shoulder surfing exercises, which takes up quite a bit of time. But we are able to rely on more direct evidence. So if we get the evidence that we need up front, we don't necessarily have to spend as much time on that in the interviews. If we can get to what we need to validate the assessment objective and to test it, we won't put you through the ringer again during the interview week to do that. We will definitely just leverage the evidence that we got. That helps streamline the process quite a bit, and we generally can wait. We can generally save what we need in the interview week to things that either we need clarifications on, we need additional evidence for, we have questions on, or things that are trending towards the not met side, so we can either get some clarification or we can give some feedback as to what we were expecting to see for that to answer that control, and then see if we can get additional evidence to support it. So we definitely take some of those approaches when trying to gain some efficiencies in this assessment process for sure.
All right, so I'm going to wrap up here with a couple little questions about looking ahead and tips and tricks and things like that for CMMC. So where do you guys see CMMC evolving over the next couple of years?
Yeah, there's obviously going to be a lot of increased demand for it as the DIB grows. One of the things that's kind of always, never never in question is defense funding. So we basically see this kind of increasing in demand over the next couple of years here, especially since now the rule is final. The final rule is final. The final rule is published. There we go. That's what I was looking for. And basically, now all these defense contractors are going to be flowing down these requirements to their subcontractors and their external service providers. So we expect that this will have knock-on effects of seeing, greatly increased demand in the next year or two for certifications and assessments. I think there'll possibly be additional extensions to other agencies and other departments. The State Department, Department of Justice are also looking at similar programs for dealing with controlled and classified information beyond just what DoD is doing with CMMC. So this may extend into other areas. We may see some FAR rules being proposed to bring CMMC-like certification process to other agencies and departments, but we haven't seen too much movement on as far as a formalization goes. There's just been a lot of speculation and talk right now.
All right, and then what advice do you think that we should be giving to organizations that are just starting their CMMC journey, that are seeing 48 CFR go into effect and are now in panic mode that they have to be compliant within the next year or so?
And I think panic mode is a good way to put it, because this can be, with everything in the news right now, like everything, this is dropping X date and things like that. It can be very panic inducing. But I think a big thing to take away here is to not panic as much, in the sense that to know that you're not alone. It's not just the assessment itself. How you actually prepare for the assessment can go an extremely long way. So if you haven't looked into readiness support, I would highly recommend doing so. But if you also, if you're going into this, you don't really know where to start, just reaching out. We have an advisory board set up currently. We have a leading member here currently. But ask questions, get involved as much as you can. I can't open LinkedIn without seeing millions of different conversations going on with CMMC, and those people having those conversations, I find, are considerably more prepared than those who are not. So big takeaway is just get involved, but also, if you haven't already, get readiness support or have someone on your team who knows the CMMC environment as much as possible, because just as an assessor, those who are more prepared do better in the long run, and just make it from a 5-day assessment down to maybe a 3-day assessment, because they are just that prepared. So.
Well, we do have a number of resources on our website as well for readiness around helping make that case to your executive leadership if they're not willing to put in the money or the budget to CMMC support. We have a number of different guides about roadmaps to getting CMMC compliant and when you should be doing different steps. There's a lot of different information out there to kind of help make your case to your leadership, figure out how you need to implement CMMC. It's not a one-man show. You cannot do this with only one person doing all of CMMC by themselves. We also have, our YouTube videos and our Hive Lives out there about CMMC 101 and what to expect and what to know. But one of the number one things that you can do is reach out to CCAs and CCPs, reach out to C3PAOs to get that readiness support from someone who actually knows the environment, knows what they're doing. I can't tell you how many of the OSCs have never cracked open the level 2 assessment guide. The level 2 assessment guide is huge for understanding what those controls actually mean and what they're going for. And I know from the assessments I've participated in, the OSCs that tried to go it alone and do it all themselves are the ones that struggle the most. And then kind of to wrap it all up here, if you could give companies one piece of advice to avoid stress during the assessment specifically, if they're past readiness and they're at the point of needing their certification, what advice would you give to those companies?
Yeah, to avoid stress during the assessment, just have the right people in the room, have the people that have been involved from the beginning. It generally helps to have the people that are performing the controls. If we have to talk about controls and requirements during the actual interviews, if we couldn't get what we needed from the evidence, it helps to have the people that perform those controls, because if it's somebody that's like at a CISO level or an ISO level, trying to speak to them, sometimes they're a little out of the loop. They're not getting the full picture. So it definitely helps to have the right people in the room. And then also just maybe doing a mock assessment. If you have a CCA on your team, having them run you through a mock assessment using the CAP and using the assessment guide, running you through it to help you prepare, or bring on a C3 PAO who's got some downtime and is willing to do a mock assessment for you. That really helps. That really goes a long way in just training you how to, one, handle the questions from the assessor, and two, make sure you're prepared and there's not going to be any gaps in your environment or in your evidence that would potentially set you back anyway. So there's a kind of a dual purpose to those mock assessments, a little bit of a gap assessment and also just preparing you for the real thing, like a dry run. But yep, generally just that.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of our smaller companies, those sort of things can sound a bit scary because they cost money. If, and in some ways, I think if you are super stressed during the actual assessment itself, I would highly recommend just being as candid as possible. I think assessments can sound fairly scary, but if there's a deficiency somewhere in your documentation, there's a reason for it. So if you can come to the table actually, being as prepared as possible in a documentation, hopefully you can get a mock assessment done. That goes an extremely long way in helping. But if not, just being, having as many eyes as possible on your documentation before it gets to your assessors, to the table itself, can also go an extremely long way. Because I personally have seen that it comes down to the CISO level knowledge, but also comes down to the people just doing the tasks, from the very, very high ups to the very, very your base level, entry level sort of positions. So having the level of knowledge sort of, spread out, but also shared in the documentation that you're creating can go a long way. And having it goes back to what Andrew was saying, is just having the right people at the table, but also giving each of those people at the table a voice in the preparing for the documentation itself. So,
yeah, there's one thing I did want to bring up, and that is the sort of proliferation of these companies that offer a one-click certification, right? Or an easy button, basically. There are no easy buttons here. So making sure that you're prepared and the people that you partner with, whether it's an MSP or, a CMMC C3PAO who's going to help you guys get prepared, making sure that they're qualified and they understand CMMC through and through, because like I said, there's no easy button here. There's efficiencies that can be gained in developing documentation and gathering evidence and screenshots and preparing for those interview processes, but you're going to have to go through each of those steps regardless. There is no one-click certification. And anybody who's offering you guys some sort of streamlined path to certification or a piggyback method or something like that, I would take that with a grain of salt and definitely do your due diligence there, because in my experience, those things actually hurt more than they help, and you may open yourselves up for all sorts of even litigation or False Claims Act violations if you go about this the wrong way. So don't look for easy buttons. Get somebody who understands the CMMC, the 32 CFR and the 48 CFR, and make sure that you are doing things the right way, because too many people fall into the trap of looking for the easiest way out, and then they end up making more trouble for themselves in the long run.
All right. Any final parting thoughts, advice, tips and tricks, things that you want to share? I know, Andrew, you just kind of thought of one and covered it, but if there's any final parting thoughts about CMMC, the assessment process, or even readiness, do you guys have anything else that you want to share?
Accept your track changes and you're done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Make sure your documentation is final. Yeah.
I would say this is more just so parting wisdom than it is advice, but the CMMC assessment process isn't like an ISO certification or a SOC 2 audit or a FedRAMP 3 PAO assessment. It's not the level of scrutiny is much more flexible. There's much more room for alternative methods of implementation and alternative methods of meeting an assessment objective that your C3PAOs will work with you on. What I'm basically trying to say here is, do not stress over this like it is a SOC 2 audit or something like that. This is a much more flexible framework designed specifically for the defense industrial base, because there are such a wide range of different types of companies within the DIB, that it is not meant to be an exclusionary process. It is meant to essentially just provide assurance, some basic assurances over your ability to protect CUI. And the interview process and the actual assessment week is not designed to be a game of gotchas. So don't go into this thinking like it's the worst type of audit you've ever been through in your life. It is definitely a more conversational, more flexible and approachable assessment type of assessment that you're going to encounter here. So don't be afraid of it at all.
And I think sort of goes along with that. You don't have to be a CCA or CCP to take CCA or CCP training, or just looking up or like generally trainings on different training websites and things like that. I know personally when I was preparing to be a CCA, I went through official training, things like that. But I also leaned pretty heavily on websites out there that give video-based trainings because I'm very much a video-based learner. So what I mean to say is, as prepared, you don't necessarily need to have the CCA. You don't need to be a CCA or a CCP to go and get yourself educated. So having a member on your team just go out and take training can go an extremely long way to having just a person in a seat at your company who understands what it means to go through a CMMC audit or a CMMC assessment. Having someone who's familiar with everything you're going to be talking about through that week, even if they aren't a CCA themselves, it would be good to get that certification or CCP. But just having them who sat through the training, it can go an extremely long way in making the interviews considerably less stressful for you during the day of. So just an idea.
All right, thank you. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us for this breakdown of commonly asked questions, assessor insights, and tips and tricks for tackling your own C3PAO assessment. If you're looking to schedule your own assessment or are just starting your CMMC journey and need support, reach out to us to learn more about how Hive Systems can help at www.hivesystems.com/CMMC. Before we go, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can be alerted for our next episode by going to www.hivesystems.com/HiveLive. Next month, we will have another great episode, so make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to our channel at www.hivesystems.com/HiveLive. Until next time, remember, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to act and not react.